We are live, and this time, Ryan, I'm not going to leave the video feed on me or on you the entire time. Is that what I did? Yes, I left it on you the entire time. So everyone who is watching this after the fact, or if you already jumped in live because you are sitting on my YouTube page waiting in anticipation, thanks for tuning in. This is basically part of my podcast called the Robert L. White Show. It's just a podcast for my website and my sort of philosophy that I like to talk about. I talk a lot about epistemology, and obviously miracles is a great sort of case study for epistemology. And I have with me Ryan Price here, who he is someone that came on and I interviewed with as part of a planned series called Robert Interviews an Atheist. So Ryan was my first guinea pig, and I think we had a pretty good discussion. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, it was pleasant. I enjoy talking to you and not having an echo chamber.
Yeah. I feel like it wasn't an echo chamber, and we weren't really two ships passing in the night either. Like, we actually figured out where some disagreements are and whatnot. It was a fruitful discussion, I think.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, you're in Denver, right?
Correct.
And you are a dog walker by trade, or dog keeper?
I'll say dog caretaker.
Caretaker. Okay, I like it. Does that include walking?
Yes.
Well, okay, cool. That is definitely a popular profession here in Brooklyn as well. You'll see people walking out with like 7 dogs all together. It's kind of funny. And you're also a musician. And before the stream started, we were talking a little bit about your projects, and I will be sure to include a YouTube link to your stuff. I've listened to some of it before and liked it, so definitely recommend Ryan's stuff. We are talking about miracles. This is something that came up in our chats before, not in, I don't think it really came up in the video chat we did before, but we've touched on it a little bit, but never really have done a deep dive. We both expressed interest. And so I thought this was a good time to do it, and you a good person to talk about it with. So kind of what I'm planning for this discussion for the listener is basically we're going to, miracles has been basically somewhat of a research project for me for the past year or two. So I'm going to just talk about how I got to that. And then Ryan has some ideas and some kind of objections. He says he wants to bring up two sort of different types of miracles and ideas of miracles. And then what I'd like to do is probably at that point is kind of bring an example of some what I think are compelling miracle cases and an overall very quick case for miracles, you could say, more just to get it out there on the table rather than give a 20-minute presentation on miracles or something like that. But with that said, I'll go ahead and start. I think it's interesting, this topic in particular for me, because one of my early blog posts was, I did a post called The Darkness of Doubt, which was all about dealing with severe intellectual doubt starting as a Christian and what that was like. And then I wrote a follow-up post later called Why I Believe. And at the end of the post, I put as sort of a caveat, I said, one thing I'd like to look into more is supernatural claims and miracles, because if the sort of power in the supernatural power that I think is in Christianity, you can easily find that in other religions. And if it just happens outside of religions, period, then that does a real blow to a case for Christianity, I think, because then it just becomes this intellectual game of arguments for God. And I think it's anemic at that point. Like, I don't think, in my post, I say that I think I'm only a Christian because of these kind of two pillars of faith. One is the intellectual arguments for it, and then one is actually witnessing and experiencing and then knowing the wider testimony of spiritual power there is, including miraculous healings and stuff like that. So anyway, it was funny to look back at that blog post from like 4 years ago about how I wanted to look into that more. And now I have a lot, and obviously it's an endless study and I do want to keep studying it. But what I like about it is it's so tangible. It's something like so many intellectual arguments for God are hard to understand, seem kind of obscure, and even if you agree the premises go through to the conclusion, it's like I still don't feel like there's a God. Even if you agree with the argument, it can just feel distant, sort of. So that's what I like about miracles, is it's visceral and immediate. And so, yeah, I mean, just I made a few notes to kind of go through here, and what I really feel like I was open to there not being that great of evidence for miracles. What I thought is I believed that they happen, but I also thought it might be that they are kind of shadowy and you can never really pin them down. And it was always sort of hearsay, some more credible than others, but it just never was very convincing. And so only the people who already kind of believed in them would believe. And I think that's what most people start out thinking they would be like. And I felt like outside of that, I still had enough reasons to believe in Christianity. So I felt comfortable researching, feeling open-minded, feeling like I was okay with there not being really compelling evidence for miracles. And so this is actually one of my epistemology episodes I'm going to do soon that I think is really key. It's going to be called knowledge bracketing. And I think one of the most important things to do when investigating anything is to make sure you're looking at it at distinct stages that are separated from the others until the end when you put it all together. But in other words, like when talking about the resurrection of Jesus, for instance, almost all scholars agree that the disciples had visions of what they thought was Jesus. And it's so important to keep that separate than is Jesus the Son of God? Because those are two separate things. Like the historians or skeptics that think that the disciples felt like they saw a vision, they don't believe the vision was real, but they think historically the disciples experienced this. They thought they experienced something. So I think miracles is one of the worst topics for things getting conflated because because so much seems to be it's just easy to mix it all together that this event happened and what are the implications of this event. So I really want to try hard in my own investigation to like what seems to have happened in this case, first of all, regardless of what our explanation is. And my goal is always to be as like honest about the data and say what seems to have happened and then completely separate that out from what we think actually happened or what the explanation is, that sort of thing. I just want to stress that like, this is true for all the stuff I do, is I want to bring more clarity about the world to people. I want Christians to know more about the humanness of the Bible, and I want skeptics to know about what I think is the copious, credible data around miracles. So even if the skeptic thinks they can still reject it ultimately, I want them to know what is out there. In fact, I love this quote. I will go ahead and give it now. There's this great podcast called Hinge. It's not about the dating app, just FYI, but it's called Hinge Podcast. And it's a Christian and an atheist co-host, like Ryan and I here. And it's only 8 or 10 episodes long, and they take different topics and interview experts and then talk. And they interview top people in the field. It's really impressive, like scholars I know of and stuff like that. And at the beginning of the miracles episode, or in the preview for it, the atheist Corey Markham says this was quote, the biggest challenge to my atheism so far these stories fly in the face of the dismissive attitude that most atheists have. And end quote. So that's what I want to get atheists to see, is that sort of data. And then they can reject it if they want to. And I really do feel like it's the same thing as skeptics who want a Christian to read a Bart Ehrman book and know about the development of the canon and how messy a lot of that was, and potential errors and contradictions in the Bible. And I get it. It's actual data that's out there. And I think, Ryan, like you would agree with me, you and I both want to know what the data is, right? And we want others to know what the actual data is.
Yeah, I want to believe what's true.
Right. And so, and I think what I tried to do, and this is maybe part of kind of the knowledge bracketing or just having more modest goals, is simply get some of this out there, no matter, like, try to make the claim as small as possible, and then you can step forward from there, basically, with any of this stuff. So yeah, I looked into this a few different ways. One of the biggest is a book by Craig Keener, who is a scholar with a PhD from Duke, a very respected historian, New Testament historian. And he ended up writing the modern day book on miracles. It's over 1,000 pages long with an insane amount of footnotes. He footnotes more than anyone I've ever seen. It's maddening at times, but it is just the book on miracles, basically a survey of all the claims worldwide. In fact, from statistics, we know that it's something like, I think at bare minimum, hundreds of millions of people claim to be eyewitness to a miraculous healing. So it's just a huge survey of the data, and some of it is much stronger than others. His goal wasn't to like prove miracles. His main goal was to show what are people claiming. And then some of it, he has better sources, better data, some of it not. But it's a fascinating book. I definitely recommend it. And then just various other ways I've tried to learn more about this topic, and I still have a lot to go. I mean, the number one thing has been slowly reading through that entire Keener book, to be honest, and then checking a few of those sources and going a little deeper. So yeah, for me, it felt like it was more powerful than I even expected. In fact, a lot more powerful. And one of the videos I will reference, I think, is a great example of that, of an interview with someone who was healed. And so I was kind of blown away from the data. And so it just confirmed that to me that there is good evidence out there. And that's kind of where I sit now. And so I want to keep building that case and being able to explain it well. And I want to open the challenge for skeptics to give me counterexamples and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm at now. So I'll hand it over to you, Ryan.
Cool. So I have, in order to not make, my goal here was to make it so, I know the complaint is that technically I could object to anything. So I'm not going to object to anything. I'm going to object to very specific things.
Okay.
And I have them they'll become increasingly encompassing and damning. So the first criticism will be the least encompassing and the least damning. So the first criticism is that there's already miracles today. There's already people who claim that somebody from some guy in India can perform miracles today, supposedly, with eyewitnesses today. And it's just not very convincing to all the Christians who supposedly believe in miracles, or all the Muslims who believe in miracles. So they already kind of know what it's like for me to be like, on that level.
Wait, what? Who knows what it's like? Say that again.
Anybody, like a Christian, would know what it's like to be skeptical towards the.
Oh yes, because we're skeptical about those
of a mystic. Yeah, you don't think that there's mystics going around performing miracles today. So then, my second criticism would be that comparing the reason and the rationale of that, the miracles that people do mostly believe in are just the same amount of testimony plus oldness and stuff like that. And that doesn't really add any more credibility. So I think that the second criticism is that how old a claim is really doesn't add anything to it, is especially if all the rest of the reasoning is something you can object to and on every other level already.
Sure.
My third criticism, which I get from reading a lot of the bigger atheists, is that Christianity thinks that it explains everything. And then we discover something that needs explained, and then somehow it stretches. And all of a sudden it can explain that too. And the way Christopher Hitchens calls it, an infinitely expanding tautology. That we knew God created life, and then, oh, well, I guess DNA kind of explains a lot of how that works. But then we know that God is a genius enough to make DNA. And so it's just whatever it is, it's infinitely expanding to map onto whatever we're going to discover anyway. So that's interesting, at least. Then the fourth one is that I can't tell the difference between being incredulous that there's going to be a natural explanation and that something is a miracle. So every time something is called a miracle, very often it's just because someone is saying, I can't personally believe that this was naturally a naturally occurring event. The only times that I know most of the time that's other than people saying I can't believe it is, instead of incredulity, it's ignorance. So my fifth criticism would be that I can't tell the difference between a miracle and just being ignorant of the natural cause of
Right.
an event. My sixth one, and second to last one, is that miracles fly in the face of physics. We cannot do physics if we can assume that sometimes things don't happen that way for totally unmappable reasons whatsoever, but like by the whim of something elsewhere that we have no access to or something. So it renders physics pretty much useless. And that's the opposite of true, evidently. And then my seventh and the biggest one is that I think that it's reverse engineering your own assumption. And that's the opposite of the way science is supposed to work. So in my head, what's happening here is people are saying, maybe God exists. How could we demonstrate that God exists if he did? Well, if God exists, maybe he would perform miracles. Well, let's look around to find miracles. Here's some things that might be miracles. Therefore, maybe God exists. But that's the whole thing that you're trying to say to begin with. So you're like going out and looking for evidence that you decided was evidence for the thing that you think is maybe true. And there was anything like it. That doesn't actually mean that it's maybe true. The way that science is supposed to work is that we have the phenomena that needs explained. And when we go to explain it, we are not going to propose anything that's a maybe. No, like God is, even if I give it a maybe, it's still just a maybe. And so when we want to explain something, what we want is to use known mechanisms that we already have, in things that are already indicated by our observations in nature, because then we can use those to form a model that has predictions that we can see if it's actually right or not. And then there's no maybes or begging the question whatsoever, and you don't get confused and just end up cycling over maybe this, maybe that, maybe this. And then you'll always be able to find another maybe a miracle, it's therefore maybe God. But you can't do that if you're thinking more clearly, when you're trying to get explanations for things like whatever the phenomena is based on specifically known mechanisms that we do know exist for sure. And so I think that's my most damning encompassing of all the miracle claims. Essentially, the thing that I think I know I'll finish on, what would it take me to believe in miracles, is essentially if you could provide me with data that did not get torn down by these objections, even if I replace the word miracle in all my objections with magic and the word God with wizard. Because essentially, I can't tell the difference between someone claiming that a wizard did something with magic, and that's the explanation. I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm being serious.
Yeah.
And that God did something with miracles. I honestly don't know what I'm supposed to believe is the difference between a wizard performing magic, if that's the explanation, and God performing miracles. That's the explanation.
Okay.
Those are my objections.
Okay. Great. Good stuff. You definitely came prepared, which I love. So I'm going to try, I wrote these down as you went, and I'm just going to go from the beginning and not try to like fully rebut everything or something like that.
I'm gonna address it.
Yeah, talk about it, and we can figure out what maybe is the most interesting path to go down. But okay, so the first thing you brought up is like non-Christian miracles and how Christians already know how to be skeptical of these sort of claims. And so is it not just basically special pleading to accept your own religion's miracles? Is that close enough?
And that the religions that they're being skeptical of, the miracle claims are happening today. So like eyewitness testimony of people who technically exist right now.
Right. So first of all, I basically exclusively looked at recent miracles, like ones happening today or recent history, not ancient history. Obviously, that's a whole nother discussion, though related, about Jesus's miracles and Muhammad's miracles and stuff like that. But
Sure.
so yes, to try to simplify what I was looking into, I really wanted to focus on the best supported current day miracles, preferably with people who are, you can interview now, that sort of thing. So, so that covers that. As far as first, to keep the argument as simple as possible, the first thing I kind of want to look at is there this strange phenomena that goes way beyond what we currently know to be physical limits, and this is where we get into definitions a little bit, currently know to be well beyond physical limits, and that happens in context of religion. And so first you could say that almost exclusively happens in context of religion. So first you could say all religion, and just does it happen, period. And then because even that's interesting, if people are healed from terminal illnesses constantly in any religion but nowhere else, it's a pretty big deal. That means something is happening. Once again, we're not talking about what the final cause is. That's still significant. And like most people don't think that today, I would say. So, but more specifically, if I were to challenge that, in my studies so far, I've not been able to come across 5% the amount or magnitude of miracle claims outside of Christianity compared to Christianity. In fact, I just did a cursory search of Islam miracles, and like the first three things I found on Google were a Islamic response to Christian miracles, trying to debunk them. The second one was about Muhammad's miracles, which is from 600 AD. So that's the ancient thing you're talking about. And the third thing was about miracles causing Muslims to become Christians. And in fact, I've done this search multiple times in the past 5 or 10 years, and I found 3 different books about Muslims becoming Christians due to miracles that are all fantastic, and I've read them all. One is this a collection. It's actually a known phenomenon, maybe even in secular sociologists, of Muslims having dreams and visions of Jesus and becoming Christians. I mean, there are literally thousands of stories of this. A lot of them are like firsthand interviews in the book I have. So first, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So with everything that you're saying, that's I don't know about the magnitude of miracles or number of claims or whatever, but I would say that the biggest objection, like if you're going to try to convince someone who doesn't already believe in miracles of miracles,
right,
isn't to the second premise. You had 2 premises. You had, is there anything that happens that's beyond the physical phenomena of the universe, and does it happen specifically in some kind of religious context? I think that most people are objecting to the first thing.
If that's happening.
Yeah, if there's a reason to ever say that has happened.
Yeah, but I feel like your first contention was sort of about non-Christian miracles. And
yeah. Sorry, I was just specifying because you were defining miracles.
Yes, gotcha. All right, so yeah, you're kind of moving the argument along, so we can come back to that. Or let me see if that. Yeah, we'll touch on that in a second as we go through. So Yeah, I think that encompasses the first two miracles, because I mean the first two contingent objections, because I think your second one was about old miracles, which I'm trying to kind of not discuss anyway.
Right. Okay.
And I'm just trying to focus it on. I'm like agreeing, conceding that.
Yep.
Let's talk
Yep.
about.
I'm with you.
Yeah, and then the Hitchens tautology thing. I believe infinitely expanding.
Yes.
So, I mean, I would say that epistemology is bad. 100%. What Hitchens is describing is bad. And so I just want to start from a different viewpoint of like, what is happening out in the world? And then what's the best explanation for it? And you can claim in the end that secretly behind the scenes, I'm using that Hitchens tautology, but I don't think I am. And I'm trying very hard not to, essentially. So I will agree with you that, I mean, I think what you're kind of describing is confirmation bias in the end, of just this is, or having a big enough worldview that can evolve and accept whatever comes into it.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that you don't really make very many mistakes like that. I mean, there are some things where you do interject a subjective opinion sort of assertively about things, like from a Christian perspective, but that
Yeah.
doesn't, I don't think that you're saying it like it's like I'm not allowed to argue it.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on from that one, since I agree with you that epistemology is bad, and I try to avoid it and let the reader decide, I guess.
Okay.
The listener decide. Finally, this I think gets back to what you're talking about before, which is like the natural explanation versus a miracle versus someone being incredulous to it happening. And this goes with your next one too, someone being ignorant to us just not knowing what happens, what could be possible, that sort of thing.
Yeah, those two specifically kind of go hand in hand.
Yes. So so before we get to that, because I feel like we're going to talk more about that one, I wanted to touch on well, I feel any of these, I think we could talk a long time on. So I'll stick with this one, the natural explanation kind of thing. So that objection you're bringing is exactly why I want to make sure in my own thinking, I'm taking it in as many slow stages as possible. And so the first stage is like, what are the credible claims and documentation that we have of what is happening out there? Okay, great.
I don't think that's the first step, though. So the first step to me would be, is there a reason to think, based on the trajectory of our current way of explaining anything, that there will ever be something that settles on, whether you call it a miracle or magic, which we also haven't got to specifically how to distinguish between the two. How would it ever be settled that science is not going to come up with a natural answer for this? How could you ever come to that conclusion fairly, given that it's always been the opposite way?
Okay, so I definitely want to respond to that, but first, my reason for approaching it the way I suggested, which is like, what is the data out there first, is I still think it's interesting from a human perspective if crazy, miraculous healings are happening around Christianity that don't happen practically anywhere else. That is still just crazy significant. And even if you're a Christian materialist and you think that it's still a natural cause somehow, and God so ordered the universe so that the natural causes would only happen to Christians, fine, that's still significant. That's why I tend to be data driven in that standpoint. And I guess part of what I'm saying is like, my epistemology is we all start with the data first and then the ideas second. So what's the data? But I want to come back to, you said it's always been the other way. And it's always been like a natural cause. And I want to object to that in at least two ways, which is, first of all, I would say it hasn't always been that way, that we have simply, our methodology has ruled out of court anything that, or basically it holds in tension anything that can't be explained naturally. So a good example, I think, of this is the Shroud of Turin. Have you heard of the Shroud of Turin, Ryan?
No,
It's
but
the
go ahead.
it's the supposed burial cloth of Jesus.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So it's really fascinating because it's considered the most studied artifact in human history, and it has this image on it of a face that arguably could be Jesus, and this all sounds super nutty until, well, first of all, the prima facie evidence of it is pretty like, wow, this is very strange. But this is the part I want to focus on. They still, even though it's the most studied artifact in human history, they still do not know how a medieval forger, as naturalists think did it, how that medieval forger created the image. They still don't know. There is no good explanation. And
that's number 5, though.
What?
Said that's ignorance.
But this is my point. It will always stay in that category for the rest of human history because of predefined metaphysics that naturalism can be the only explanation. It can never be confirmed.
That's assuming the conclusion. I'm not.
So what do you mean? I'm assuming the conclusion.
Assuming that it would always stay in that category because we'll always stay ignorant of how it was.
I'm just saying. No. I'm saying if we stay ignorant, like let's say it takes. There's no. Okay. There's no ever be considered a miracle ever.
I think that I can think of a lot of things that we're definitely super ignorant about, but none of them warrant something that we came up with thousands of years ago. I think what they warrant is a new model we haven't come up with yet. So essentially, I guess what I'm saying here is science does not reject mysteries that it can't solve. It rejects magic as an explanation for those mysteries. And so there's a difference between saying that science has ruled out magic and saying that science has ruled out mystery. Science is happy to say that I don't know, but if science doesn't know the answer through the methods of science, then there is no better way to know the answer. And I would say that the challenge that I would use to demonstrate that is you're not going to find anything through the course of all human history that was once explained best by science and then eventually became best explained by religion. But you will always find things the other way around.
I think that ultimately is begging the question, because I think the rules of the game don't allow anything to be confirmed as
it's essentially.
Read a quote. Actually,
okay. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to assume the pattern we observe as opposed to one that we imagine.
Okay, but all right. Keener has a really good response section in his book about this. And he talks about that you say, and this goes to your final objection about physics, that physics can't be done. Oh, wait, actually, this might be different than that. But anyway, he talks about that it's not true in science that we don't use new ideas to explain new phenomenon. That a key part of moving science forward is to postulate these ideas that don't necessarily relate to anything we've seen before. And that's the only way to get new data. And so it's not true to say, well, we can only explain something in terms of what we've seen before, because a lot of what how science has progressed has been through creative thinking and then finding the evidence to confirm that creative thinking. So I don't think that's true. That
I'm both in agreement with you, but I think that that's a little bit of a twisted way of viewing things, because although yes, essentially when Albert Einstein came up with the idea that space and time are the same functional thing, that's super creative. But he wasn't pulling from anything else. What he did was he took things that we already knew, and he took something else that we already knew, and he connected it. Those are the kinds of new ideas that science always comes up with. We take electricity and we take magnetism and we make electromagnetism. And then we take electromagnetism and light and we make the electromagnetic spectrum and photons. And we keep getting more and more creative, but it's still only pulling from what we know and what experiments show. It's not it's not really saying that any creative thing goes, really. It's still, everything's being pulled from previous math. Einstein borrowed from Newton to create general relativity. And so although science totally progresses, and Newton had no idea about the ideas of like space-time or anything like that, and that's why he got things wrong, the creativity that Einstein used is not based on his own creativity alone. It's based on what he knew, and then he just connected things in a new way, which is different than proposing an entirely new set of paradigms that would explain how things happen in the universe.
I think I don't know, when you move on to stuff like quantum physics and indeterminacy, you can say that it's just putting together exactly what we had before. Now it's confirmed when you do the math and everything, but I just don't know if it completely bears that out. But let me read this quote really quick, because I think it's really interesting. Because I think talking about bias against miracles is absolutely key, because if there is no bias at all against accepting miracles, then it's hard. Then it's kind of like this question of like, well, why don't we just all know that there's miracles anyway? But this is my favorite part. But okay, I'm gonna read a few quotes just because I think this is an important part of the discussion. But I'll go pretty quick. Okay, so like one doctor who recounts miracles that have occurred in his practice also notes that the prejudice against miracle reports is so strong that even doctors who have seen miracles are often reluctant to risk their reputation to verify them. To include mention of prayer in the notes, which go to referral doctors and can be used by malpractice lawyers, carries serious risks in some places. More generally, beyond theistic premises, and anthropologists have sometimes feared to publish anomalous experiences from their field work for fear of stigmatization. This is my favorite quote. It's more related to what we're talking about. Radical Enlightenment scientists reacted against popular supernaturalist interpretations of meteorites by denying the existence of meteorites altogether. Poligny observes, during the 18th century, the French Academy of Science stubbornly denied the evidence for the fall of meteorites, which seemed massively obvious to everyone else. Their opposition to the superstitious beliefs which a popular tradition attached to such heavenly intervention blinded them to the facts in question. Because Paris set the intellectual trends of the day, museums in at least 5 other European countries discarded their meteorites. One need not attach theological significance to meteorites to note that a bias against that interpretation functioned as a prejudice that disregarded facts. Would such a bias necessarily disappear in cases where facts might more readily support a supernatural interpretation than they did in the case of meteorites? So in other words, healing. So I think it's important that, like, I love the meteorite example because it just shows that, like, the heavens don't exist physically, therefore nothing can come from them. So these things that might come from them, we have to discard. I don't know. What do you think about that quote?
So all of those quotes, I think, and the general point that you're getting across, at least as far as I can tell, is misrepresenting what is being rejected or what the bias is towards. So I think that sometimes you're saying things like people are biased towards anything that might seem mysterious and that we can't currently have an answer for. And I think they're biased somewhat towards like the way people are going to respond and jump all over the opportunity on every time they don't know the answer. That might be it. But I think more science's bias is, like I said, it's not against mystery, it's against magic. So the best way to say that is,
what if magic is real? How would we ever know?
Then my favorite response to this question is Aaron Ra's response to this question. He says, if magic was real, there would be someone like Obi-Wan who could demonstrate that, even if we couldn't explain it. He could demonstrate it on demand. Like Harry Potter could demonstrate it on demand. Even if we couldn't explain it. Explaining it would be the hard part, not demonstrating it whenever we need to show that it's real. And so that's a big difference. I think that science is not rejecting anything other than like model-less explanations. It requires that things function like not just with a picture, but when you hit the play button, then it actually functions the way the world does. And so I think that it's rejecting magic because magic doesn't come with a picture that actually explains anything. It just says, I don't know, some immaterial energy, force, words that I don't really understand accomplished something. And so
But
that's why science rejects it, because it doesn't have a model, I think, as opposed to because it's mysterious, is my
But
point.
if it truly rejects it and you're committed to only science, then if Obi-Wan is standing there in front of you, you're saying you're required to reject what you're seeing with your own eyes, right?
No, the opposite. I am required to say that this whatever it is a real phenomena in the universe.
Yeah.
Magic is obviously a real phenomenon in the universe. I don't currently have an explanation for it the same way I don't currently have an explanation for what happens to space-time in the center of a black hole.
Right.
That doesn't mean that I think maybe anything goes. I think that there's probably some mechanical model of things that no one's come up with, just like everything else. And if Obi-Wan was standing right next to me doing all those things, that's exactly what I would think when he was doing that. He's obviously inherently right. I have to accept the world as is demonstrated.
You would think what was happening when you saw him?
I would inherently assume that the force was real, magic was real, and that
Yeah.
I just don't understand how, and that someday there will be that model, and science will then accept the model of how magic works. And that will be no longer magic, because essentially there will be a natural explanation and a model for how it's functioning.
Okay, how is that not fundamentalist to assume there will be that scientific explanation rather than the force exists?
Okay, because I'm not starting there. I don't assume that as a presumption. I conclude that based on a pattern that continues to happen. So I start with, I really don't know how things are going to play out.
Yeah.
But science has a certain track record, and certain religions have certain track records and everything. And when I put all that together, then I get a new starting assumption, which isn't I'm totally blank. It's science always explains things, and everything that it hasn't explained is where religion has receded to. And that's an interesting pattern. So I'm going to stick with the pattern.
All right, that's we're back to the pattern, and that's first of all where I want to say that anything that might have actually been miraculous that has happened before will just remain unexplained. It will just never. So in other words, it seems like the pattern. To me, the pattern starts to seem almost circular because it's explaining this big stuff, but it will. I'm not trying to reinvent the big stuff, like where does lightning come from? I'm talking about these unexplained things and they've always been unexplained. The Shroud of Turin it can never be labeled that magic happens. And secondly, I want to say, what if we look at that magic and say, okay, we'll explain it one day, but that magic is only happening in religious contexts and specifically Christian contexts and during when the person thinks they're talking to a deity, and they even think they hear words that say that this miracle is going to happen, and then it happens. Like, are you going to keep saying, well, that religion isn't true, and there's still a natural explanation at that point?
I'm not going to assume anything, but what I would do, okay, so you're just not getting around the idea that when we don't know the answer to something, or when we just can't believe that there's going to be an answer to something, that therefore it might be something else. That doesn't actually follow. Essentially, it's not that I would never, like I said, I would admittedly happily take on miracles or magic or whatever it was. I literally don't care what the phenomena is. I care that it's demonstrably part of the natural world and like a real phenomena. And miracles don't seem to be phenomena. They seem to be explanations for instances we can't explain or something like that, which is different than saying, here's a demonstrable phenomena that we can predict will happen under these circumstances, and it always does.
So first of all, if you require it to be demonstrable in that way, then you're requiring it to be not
real.
Because
that's not true. I'm requiring it to be real.
Demonstrable and repeatable, then you're requiring it to be a system, and a system isn't an agent. So you're that in a miracle.
Yeah, well, that's not true, because according to the whole religion, like Christian religion, God has a very specific system of behavior, and he never deviates from that system of behavior. And so you could still use everything that you allegedly know that's permanent or tantamount, and you could use those things to predict other things. Like, oh, we don't know who he's going to heal, but obviously he heals these kinds of people in these kinds of circumstances. We go out, look for those exact kind of people, and like, all right, that person there is going to be healed because that's the kind of person that God goes for. The fact of the matter is we can't do that. We only
Actually,
it's only retrospective.
Okay, well, first of all, since these are individual events, okay, I simply think I have a peer-reviewed study showing exactly what you're talking about, where they saw a pattern of miraculous healings with Christianity. They took a team out there, they tested it for healing deafness and vision, and it's accepted into the Southern Medical Journal, I believe, and I have a link to it, so I'll send it to you. But this is the quote from it that I think is so key. Let me find it. Where is it? Sorry, I have a bunch of notes thrown in here. Okay, so here it is. This is quoting from Dr. Kathy Gunther Brown, is the researcher, and it says, whereas, and this is she went to Mozambique with, I think her name is Kathy Baker, is the ministry leader there that is known for healings. And so she went there. So this is like a pattern and going to test this pattern. And this is what the findings show. And this was in a peer-reviewed, accepted article in a secular journal. And it says, whereas improvements after hypnosis for healing and deafness, for hearing and eyesight, deafness and blindness. So whereas improvements after hypnosis have averaged 2 to 2.5 times increase in the most optimistic studies and none in the others, the average visual acuity improvement measured for those receiving prayer through the earlier mentioned ministry in Mozambique was over 10-fold. So right there, that is a dramatic difference between prayer and not. And it was predicted because they said this is happening among this group of people. They went out and found it. And there's a lot of these healing ministries where you could say, here's a pattern, and the credible testimony and evidence is there in Keener's book.
Okay, so first I would say that is you're doing the infinitely expanding tautology right then with
How?
So the first thing you did was say that you can't predict it, you can't test it with science, you can't use that sort of thing because science inherently rejects it, and now you're using science to try to indicate it.
I'm saying it's not a perfect system. You can't pull a lever and make the person blind again, and then do the same thing and make that person unblind again. You can't.
That's fair. But there's also one other thing that with science is that sample size and is a significant thing. So you're saying that there is a case where these claims are made in a journal ever. Science is things that are the pattern always. And whenever
that's what I reject is the always. You're dealing with an
that's
agent.
what science is. Science is
science. I'm not saying
science is, okay, hold on. So science itself is tentative conclusions about the way things always are. The only thing that ever changes in science are the tentative conclusions about the way things always are. Because we develop better and better models that explain more and more phenomena more encompassingly. But they all assume that it's always the same way all the time. Because otherwise you couldn't ever think, like, in order to assume that a miracle can happen, what you essentially have to assume is that particles can do things other than what they naturally would have done, or that everything just naturally was going to happen anyway that way, in which case you are no longer talking about anything influencing the universe to make that happen. So either particles are going to do what they were already going to do, and you gave up the idea of miracles, or you're saying that particles can do something other than what science says they should do, and that's saying that physics doesn't actually function.
So this is my problem with all that. Oh, first of all, I want to be clear that the phenomena I'm talking about is not a system and you're right, can't be studied in the same scientific way that we study how particles work. No, but we can still do studies to see trends and stuff. We can see trends about what people choose about their political affiliations, but that doesn't mean the agent else is a scientific system. That,
I agree with that. I just think that that's sort of playing into your own bias no matter what, because we are pattern-seeking animals. So if you start with maybe something, let's go look for evidence of it, let's go look for studies for it, that's not the same as what science does.
No, but that's not okay. But that's not what I'm doing. I want to be very clear about that. Like, I can't find anything even close to that sort of peer-reviewed article. Not only in another religion, but even like hypnosis, like she cites. Like, I'm willing, for the skeptics listening, give it to me. Give me the alternate, credible, peer-reviewed, possible stuff like this. Like I'm describing what I see the data out there, and where I'm barely touching on some of the other stuff. Like, there's this incredible video that I know you saw, Ryan, of this lady, Barbara, who had multiple sclerosis, was on her deathbed, legally blind. Her hands and feet were like curled up. She heard an audible voice from God that said, "Get up and walk." She got up and walked, was fully healed, was not blind, and walked into her church service that night. And two of her doctors have written books and included her story in it. And I actually bought one of the books just to confirm and read the section in there. And I saw the newspaper clipping about her. These, for the people listening, I've only been able to barely touch the surface of what's out there. And in fact, just so people know what's on the table, I want to read one other very quick quote, and then I'm going to come back to what we're talking about, Ryan. So I like this just because it shows the magnitude of what's being claimed. So Keener says, Craig Keener, the author of the book Miracles, in the modern period, and remember, he's a legit scholar, very well-respected scholar, PhD from Duke, said, in the modern period, I have come across claims of perhaps 400 healings of blindness through prayer, the majority of them from sources that I trust, some of them eyewitnesses I personally interviewed or know personally, and these can be regarded as merely a representative sample. Certainly, a vastly larger number of blind persons are not healed, but the healings of blindness nevertheless remain significant. Some of these healings have included medical documentation of organic problems, including, as noted earlier, scarring of the eye tissue, which disappeared during the healing. In some cases of healings from blindness, the eyewitness reporters have observed eyes white from cataracts immediately change as the cataracts have disappeared. As noted earlier, cataracts can normally be removed medically only by surgery. So I'm just trying to put that on the table, of what's being claimed here by a legit scholar. You can reject it. And before I give it back to you real quick, Ryan, the last thing I want to put on the table for you to discuss is, I feel like I can make your entire case against miracles here against aliens visiting the earth. I could say, let's say someone is claiming that there's a lot of evidence that aliens have visited the earth. And let's say there really is. To you and I, there would be a lot of evidence. We would consider a lot of evidence. Although we haven't seen an alien shape, a world leader's hand, there's a lot of evidence. But I feel like I can make all the same rebuttals you make against them. I could say, well, that denies physics, because if an alien is moving an object, is sucking up a cow, well, the particles are acting differently than we know from Earth. Always.
No, that's not accurate. So I'll respond to that, and then I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
So first of all, in a beam of that aliens would do, that would all be phenomena that particle physicists would be able to explain each electron. So the objection is that in miracles, particles do things that they would not normally do down their trajectory or based on the other particles that they interact with.
I guess what I'm saying, if the aliens are using a technology we don't know about and can't see,
it wouldn't matter, because particles still function the same way. So in the future, we will have technology that we currently cannot even imagine because we haven't come up with it, and therefore we haven't even developed it, and all of those things. There will be better, cooler technology. None of it's going to defy the laws of physics. It's all going to be working the same way that quarks and electrons allow the universe to function as.
But I mean, what if God is using a substructure of physics we don't know about? Like, I guess what I'm saying is the ignorant thing that why aliens could interact in a way that is so beyond our comprehension that it looks like magic, but we should still be open to evidence that that's happening. And it's not necessarily repeatable. It's not necessarily this perfect pattern you can predict because once again, so it might not be a rigorous scientific thing of measuring temperature changes, but shouldn't we be able to conclude that aliens are visiting at some point with enough data?
Right, but if we concluded that the technology that they were using was magic, that would be jumping the gun because we have lots of reason to think that in the future, science will explain what we currently think of as magic.
And I'm not talking about that. I'm just simply, can't we conclude that aliens are visiting at some point?
Yeah, when there's direct reason to think so.
Yeah, and that's all I'm saying about miracles is like
I'm not saying okay, so miracles don't have footprints on a beach and then we get to infer that there's a person. There is not anything quite like that. But anyway, so I think that we can get more to the bottom of something if I ask you a question.
Okay.
Let's assume that science eventually in the next 20 years comes up with a theory of everything and some prediction that actually proves it. And so we know that there's a multiverse, which is the source of the universe, and we have the physical laws that describe and govern every single thing that's going to happen within it. So there's no supernature. Okay. How would you then explain all of the case studies that you are interested in and all the things without in that world, in that hypothetical world, how would you go back and explain everything?
How would I go back and explain all the things the phenomena I'm talking about?
Yeah, that you're currently using as evidence of miracles. If you knew there wasn't supernature in some hypothetical world, then what would you do in retrospect to correct for that?
I mean, I would use the explanations that we had at that point of.
What if the explanation is we still don't know? I mean,
we still don't know. Okay. I mean, if somehow I knew, I mean, okay, this comes down to the crux of the issue. You're right. If somehow I knew for certain there was no supernatural force, then I would hold an intention because I would be like, I don't, I would just say I don't know at that point because I know for some independent reason that there absolutely is no supernatural realm.
Okay. So essentially, minus the certainty, that's really what I think you're contending with, because it seems like what you think is that people are rejecting notions, and it's not really that they're rejecting notions, it's that supernature has not been demonstrated to them as something that they is a viable phenomena that they get to pull from as an explanation, whereas to you it is a viable phenomena that you get to pull from for an explanation. So science is not rejecting miracles or magic or anything like that. It's rejecting that there is some other domain at play when there doesn't appear to be any other domain at play. Like, I know that let me give you, I mean, I know that this is super technical, but it's interesting to me. We did experiments on electrons that we were trying to see if it's possible that there are other dimensions that interact with electrons that we are unaware of. So like maybe there's other influences in the universe. And the prediction is if there is, then the magnetic sphere around the electron would have a dip in it because that's where the interaction would happen. Even if that's the best we could get and there's a super weak interaction, it's got to be at least strong enough to have some effect. So when we test it, we get perfect spheres. And so that is evidence that there's nothing other than particles controlling what happens amongst each other. There's no other dimension of anything. Now, I'm not saying you think there's another dimension. I'm just saying,
yeah,
I've used this argument against someone who does think there's another dimension. Okay. And so the point being, we currently have good reason to think that the laws that we already have govern everything other than essentially made up things like singularities and dark matter, things that we don't know what they physically are yet. Everything else is not just understood, it's understood how well it's understood. So the chances of particles ever doing things that they just don't seem to do in any other way, I think the implications of miracles might be more catastrophic than you think it is, because everything is webbed together in particle physics in a very particular way. And so that's what I mean by because we can predict the evolution of the system given any one moment in time, that implies that there's no miracles. It's the Einstein quote of the only miracle in all of nature is that there are no miracles in all of nature. And he's essentially saying that's like the most wonderful thing is that we can study everything and that somehow, some way we can understand it.
Yes, regularity of nature fits very well with a theistic worldview, I would say. But yes, I know where you're saying.
So that's essentially the point here, is that it's not just by the seat of our pants that we're believing in naturalism. It's that it's all the indications we have for everything that we know the explanation for is natural. Everything that we have undisputable explanations for is natural. And it's always been that way, and it's increasingly becoming that way. And that's not the same as a presumption that rules out supernature. That just says we don't have any reason to even assert that supernature is possible. We do have reason to think all these other things are possible.
Let me give you another example that's very related to this. Some philosophers have, and maybe they're scientists. I think I read this, an article about this on the website Nautilus, which is a great website. But it was positing that what if consciousness, we might have talked about this, what if consciousness is the most fundamental part of the universe? And consciousness, instead of being this feeling like this added on thing, what if it's like the fundamental fabric? And to me, it seems like scientists, they might feel a little uneasy about it, but they're like, oh, that's okay. That's a part of what we know. If there's this revolution in our understanding that consciousness is fundamental. But as soon as you say, what if there's like a kind of supernatural realm that's fundamental? It's like, no, we can't go there. But consciousness is just—
Do you see the difference?
But it's a reversal. Consciousness is a reversal of everything we've seen before, that it's fundamental when everything has been determined by particles so far. It's another reversal.
That's not true. Consciousness is a sticky subject because people define it differently.
Yes.
But if we're just talking about awareness, then we're not talking about control. This is a really hard subject to talk about with, I'm sorry, I don't mean this insulting in any way, but with a religious person, it's very hard to talk about the fact that your ego is a mind construct, because most people conflate their ego and their soul and their personality and the ideas that they have all as one thing. But essentially, there's no reason to say that consciousness, which is your awareness, is in control of your system. And so because of that, it's not executing free will, it's experiencing the emergent will of the particles that you are. And so you've never actually done anything but experience the result of the particles. Awareness is one of the things they can do, like wetness is one of the things they can do on a lower level.
I don't know if what you're saying squares with these scientists and philosophers who are positing this idea that consciousness is fundamental.
I think it's possible that consciousness is fundamental, but there's a lot of reasons to think that it isn't, given like neurology and how when you damage the brain, you can damage very specific things that you're conscious of.
I guess my point is, like, it seems like, except when you get into religious areas, that people can often, scientists and philosophers can often be fine with these big reversals being at a potential, when it's like something like consciousness being fundamental, even though that has not been true so far. Every time so far. And another example I still think is good is that
I think you're just missing the distinguishing thing between religion and consciousness, is that consciousness is a known phenomena. It's a mystery. Science does not reject mysteries. It rejects magic. So we don't have a model of consciousness, which means we don't have an explanation for it.
Yeah.
And that just means that there is something we don't know, just like anything else. Like if in the hypothetical world where we already know there's no supernature, if we already know for a fact that supernature is an incoherent idea, then we still have consciousness. And so it's not magic. And so the reason why scientists are quicker to accept consciousness than supernature or religion is because it's significantly more indicated. It's indicated to everyone where religion only seems to be indicated to the particular adherence to that religious faith at that particular time in the particular way that they are claiming that it's right.
Okay, yeah. So part of it, I guess part of my response was simply that you were initially saying it's all been in this direction so far, then we're going to follow that pattern of the incredible shrinking God, of what he explains, kind of. And I guess my point would bring up the consciousness thing and indeterminism coming at the end of determinism, is these big reversals have happened where it seemed like everything was explained a certain way. And then it was like, oh crap, we got to the most fundamental layer and it's very different than we expected. Even though you're saying, okay, well, at least we have a pattern in nature somehow to describe it, which, I mean, I don't know if we have a pattern for the indeterminacy. That's kind of its own thing. And maybe there's some mystery there.
Yeah, we do. No, the evolution of particle systems. So quantum mechanics, all the mystery of quantum mechanics. So that you have point A where particles are over here and point B where they're going to be over here. All of the mystery is in between. So if we take the math seriously, we can watch the system evolve perfectly according to what's going on.
Yeah, but it's because of like the statistical probabilities cancel each other out on a large scale. Isn't that what you're talking about?
Right. So essentially what I'm saying is indeterminacy and uncertainty in quantum mechanics doesn't actually mean that there's uncertainty in how things are going to play out. It's
on the small scale, we don't really have an analogy for something being truly indeterminate.
Right. It's just that we only know what it's going to amount to. We know for sure what it's going to amount to, though. We just don't know what's going to amount to it.
In science, we discovered a new phenomena that we don't really have an analogy for, which is true indeterminacy of like a single particle's spin direction or whatever.
Correct. Yeah.
So, okay, to me, that's an example right there.
But that's it's not indeterminate. It's indeterminate to us and our ability to observe it because it's based on.
Yeah.
So at point A and point B. So
what else like that? Truly indeterminate that we had before to use as an analogy.
Well. There's nothing. It's not as indeterminate as in the way that you want it to be, is essentially what I'm trying to say. It's indeterminate, essentially, how you get from point A to point B, but it's not indeterminate what it's possible. It's just that there's an infinite amount of possibilities and seemingly all but one of them cancel each other out. Understanding how that works, there's not no models that, like, I know of a model. I was just watching physics channel earlier try to describe using one dimension of space and 3 dimensions of time, and on one half of like a multiverse and the other one having 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. Then you can explain away things like entanglement. You can explain away things like what's happening in the in-between moments there and indeterminate moments. And it's not that it's indeterminate. It's not that it's everywhere. It's that there's this other bigger model to explain it. Doesn't mean that model's true at all. But it's not that it's purely everyone is accepted, who knows. It's that we accept that if we use a certain set of equations that don't tell us what happens in the middle, we can still see what happens at the end anyway, regardless of what happens in the middle. And so that's why it's called indeterminate, not because it's actually purely something we could never discover.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I still just think it's a pretty good example of something that didn't have a true analogy before, of something that to science seemed truly indeterminate, like the individual event. And I mean, famously, Einstein said God does not play dice and hated the ideas of it because it went against the thinking.
I agree with that. There being no analogy for it before is fine, but it's more like, why was the analogy of it drawn? It was drawn because a bunch of experiments happened and we were like, why is it always that way no matter what? And so we came up with these theories to explain something that always is a certain way, not that for something that was ever a certain way.
So to me, that's an artificially high bar to say that it has to be a system that is always a certain way. Like, I mean, to me, if there is good evidence that there is sometimes indeterminacy, which is indeterminate itself, I guess, then we should believe it. Even if you can't put it in a laboratory and it happens every single time, if there's good evidence that there's sometimes indeterminacy, we should believe it.
Right, but we should only believe it under the paradigm in which it makes sense. So the only time uncertainty has ever been shown to be a factor is when you're trying to understand what a particle is doing before you observe it. That's essentially impossible because in order to observe, say you want to observe a particle over here, you have to shine particles on it and then get those particles back. And then you see what it is that you looked at. But because particles are so small and the other particles you're using are so small, they actually affect each other. So the particle that you end up seeing isn't necessarily the one that you initially looked at in the same with the same properties of the same in quantum mechanics that way. So things are indeterminate because of what we have access to.
Mhm.
Because in order to touch a particle, you have to touch it with another particle, and then you started a reaction, and then you can only get the data of that reaction. That does not mean that we think that maybe anything goes before that happens, or that there will never be a scientist clever enough to find a way to reverse a test where you don't have to touch it. Maybe there will be a way to test things in the future that we're not currently clever enough to come up with. But I just want to point out that, like, essentially, indeterminacy in science is accepted. It's just within a paradigm that's already been shown demonstrably, and they don't just sit there and let it be that way. They still try to come up with more and more models that still explain it away more and more successfully, I should add.
Okay, well, since we probably should wrap it up, I'm going to let you have the last word on that topic. And plus, I'm not sure how many of our viewers are quantum physics enthusiasts, so they
Fair
might
enough.
have a little bit lost there. But no, I mean, I appreciate getting into that some of that stuff, and I think that's one of the most interesting like events in the history of science is how unexpected I feel like that seems to have been all those
Oh, yeah.
discoveries. But I'm going to wrap up on my end real quick, and then I'll give the floor to you. But to kind of, I wanted to revisit one thing you said, and it's that okay, we have this mysterious phenomena, and let's posit an explanation, God, and and I agree that that is a bad way to do things because you could also posit the flying spaghetti monster. Why not? You know, that's not how epistemologically I do it. What I think there's at least two stages. One is what is the data out there, and I think this data exists, and I think this data clusters around Christianity in a crazy amount in number and also magnitude. And so I think that's something. Even if this is one thing I wanted to say is like, even if I became convinced Christianity was not true for other reasons, let's say we dug up Jesus's grave, bones and all, and a diary entry from Peter saying we made it all up is included in the casket, then I would still believe in some sort of supernatural agents and forces because of the data I feel like I've experienced. Like I really mean that like if I felt like, and this is even true when I was in my deepest doubt, I felt like the data I had still made it seem like there are these forces and agents from what I'd seen. So it's not, I just want to show that it's pretty fundamental to what I feel like I've seen in the world. But ultimately, to explain it in terms of like Christianity, I think it has to be to actually get to the God thing. I think it probably has to be part of a cumulative case. That one piece of this case is, wow, there's this weird phenomenon that seems to only happen around Christianity during prayer. That's crazy. Now, here are these other arguments for believing in Christianity as well. Okay, this is all starting to be a cohesive thing. So that's very different than saying, hey, there's some weird phenomena over here. Hey, I wonder if there's a God. Like that is absolutely a leap and a gratuitous leap. Yeah, I want to make sure I explain how I'm coming at it from. So take it away, Ryan.
All right. So based on what I got from you specifically, separate from all my personal arguments, is I think that the most obvious, maybe not the deepest, but the most obvious criticism that I would have is that some of the things you say are like studies on miracles. Whereas I would want to distinguish the difference between a phenomena and an explanation for a phenomena. There's no
Sure.
such thing as a study on general relativity. There's no such thing as a study on quantum mechanics. Those are the explanations for what there are studies on.
Like the study in Mozambique was about the phenomena, what is happening there in the presence of Christian prayer, but it's not trying to explain it.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm saying is a lot of times a way for you to prevent yourself from doing any of the things that I did object to is to purposefully distinguish between a study on miracles and a study on a phenomena. And
Okay.
someone saying that something happened and someone saying that under a certain context, it seems like a miracle that something happened is indistinguishable. The second one is it's not actually scientifically relevant because you're not demonstrating that it's ever a factor at all. So essentially, in an experiment, what you want to do is make sure that all the factors except one control factor are under
Right.
the parameters. So if we already know that the phenomena is happening, don't read into it like maybe that's possibly a miracle. Not even like maybe it's possible. Like if the studies are saying studies on miracles, then it's already implying that the explanation could be miracles. Where in real science, that's not how it works.
I mean, that this study, I don't think said that. And like, I'm just using that as a shorthand because we are discussing miracles. So I'm saying,
sure, yeah. I just wanted to distinguish between a miracle being an explanation for something that happens in the real world and a miracle being something that happens in the real world. There can be lots of studies on people who use miracles as explanations, but that's not quite the same as them actually being proposed as an explanation or being taken seriously by a community of experts as an actual explanation for something, which is the
sure.
phenomena. So the goal here is always accept the phenomena, not the explanation.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the first stage of this discussion, from my viewpoint, is to talk about the phenomena. Like the New York Times recently had a really interesting article on UFO sightings. I don't know if you happen to see that. It was really great. But the first stage is just the phenomena of an unidentified flying object. And then you take all that in, and then you can say, okay, what the heck is this aliens? You know?
Right. I mean, everything else I don't disagree with much of what you say, and I think that I wish essentially all Christians thought about things as much as you did. So
Well, thank
I
you.
don't have any issue with this conversation whatsoever. But I know that you take it super seriously, and a lot of like the most pinnacle things in your life revolve around it. So it's probably harder for you to have this conversation being challenged than it is for me, because really, I mean, worst case scenario, I find out that there's a good reason to believe in
Right.
something that I didn't already. Best case scenario, I get you to understand that there isn't. So
Right.
I don't have much to lose on my end.
And I just have my own salvation and your salvation to worry about.
Oh yeah, I forgot that's important to you.
So
Yeah.
no big deal. No, it's always great talking to you, Ryan. I think for being someone that I randomly found online very early in posting my blog and stuff like that, we click very well, and I think are able to understand each other's arguments very well for the most part, and mostly stay on the same page as far as what we're talking about, which is I definitely appreciate.
Yeah, I appreciate the evolution of your thinking.
And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. And viewers and listeners can probably expect Ryan to be on future episodes at some point when we have something we really want to discuss. And Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. And I look forward to future discussions.
Same. Take care.
All right. Bye.